And of course, Jesus himself asked, who do you say that I am, or who do men say that I am? To answer that question is of the utmost importance. Who is Jesus? And it's not just, who is he to me? I mean, it's who is he? He is who he is, regardless of what I believe about him. It's really a question of, is my mind, is my heart, is my faith aligned with who Jesus really is? Who is he? If he was raised from the dead, then we certainly have reason to believe, a greater reason to pay attention to what he had to say than if he had just been a man who was spouting his opinion on the earth. So, there are some historical approach issues. There's a whole lot made today amongst historians about interpretation of events based on biases and presuppositions. That, for example, if you approach history as miracles can't happen, for example, or if you approach history that miracles could happen, you're going to look at events differently. I want to try to avoid that as much as possible, first of all, by recognizing that yes, people do have biases and presuppositions, and yes, I'm coming at it believing that it's true. However, I want to be able to examine the evidence and see if it supports a conclusion or not just do I believe this because I want to believe it. And hostile witnesses are often given extra weight. So if you have a witness who's testifying to something that happened, but they're not a Christian, well, that's kind of interesting. So, where to start? If you've ever thought about this, what can we know about Jesus from non-Christian sources? If we didn't have the Bible, if we didn't have that book right there, what would we know about a man named Jesus in history?
He had long hair and beard.
He was a man who walked the earth. And
I don't even know that we would actually know that.
And he was a prophet.
Well, let's take a look. How about that? FLAVIUS Josephus, okay, lived from 37 AD to 101, wrote this: the parts that are in white here are in question as to whether they're actually parts of his writing. They are probably not. They were probably added by Christians later, because some of the copies of his manuscripts don't contain those. But the yellow sections, historians are in unanimous agreement, are part of what he said. So now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. You can see, and he was the Christ. First of all, it's doubtful whether Josephus would have said that, even though he was Jewish. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. Again, the section about the resurrection is in question, so we'll leave that alone. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. There's certain parts that can be gathered not only about Jesus, but we also know about Herod and John the Baptist and Jesus' brother James from Josephus' writing, along with Caiaphas, Herod's brother Philip, King Agrippa, and Ananias the high priest. All of these are people that are listed in the Bible and in Josephus' writings. Thallus. This is kind of interesting because what we have is a report of a report, but in a chronicle from 800 AD, don't ask me to pronounce all of these names, Georgius quotes Africanus as saying that in a book called A History of the World, written around 220 AD, Africanus was quoting Thallus, who was attributing the darkness in his lifetime, which occurred around Jesus' crucifixion, to a solar eclipse. Even though we know that a solar eclipse did not occur at that time. And the resurrection occurred during a full moon, and you can't have a solar eclipse during a full moon. You can have a partial lunar eclipse, which did actually occur on the morning of of the resurrection. So there was a blood moon that morning, in case you didn't know that. It's kind of interesting. We saw a blood moon not all that long ago, if you remember. I don't know if you got a chance to see it or not. You know what that looks like? It actually does turn red. Yeah.
So going back to the last man, how can you really call him a witness if he was born 4 years after Jesus was crucified?
No, he wrote this around 52 AD. He wasn't born at that time.
No, I'm talking the last person.
Josephus?
Josephus?
Yes, it said 32.
Well, he's a witness to the events.
But it
He
said-
was writing a history of what happened of the Jews.
but he was-
Antiquities of the Jews is the title of his.
See, he says 37,
Yeah, he was born from 37. He was born in 37.
but that's 4 years after Jesus was born.
That's
I
correct.
mean,
He's not necessarily a witness to the events, but he is recording what happened during that time.
that's right.
He's recording a history before he was born, yes. So obviously he's getting his information from a variety of sources, including the Old Testament, by the way, because he has a lot to say about the Old Testament. Anyhow, Africanus is quoting Thallus in order to dismiss his claim, claiming instead that the darkness was introduced by God because the Lord happened then to suffer. So obviously Africanus was a Christian, but he's referring to the writing of a man who was attributing the darkness to a solar eclipse. If Thallus' reference is accurate, it predates many of the New Testament writings in 52 AD. We'll come back to that, some of the dates in a minute. Tacitus wrote this, referring to Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea. What is this mischievous superstition that broke out that this Roman is referring to? Very likely it may refer to the resurrection itself, that somebody rose from the dead. Though that can't be proved, it's still the fact that there was some strange superstition that broke out at that time. But this at least corroborates that Christ was crucified under Tiberius and Pontius Pilate. Pliny the Younger refers to Christians as singing a hymn as if to a god. So what we have here is Christians were worshiping Jesus as God by the Roman testimony. Some other things, it said they bound themselves to a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to testify or falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver. He's talking about good character. He's not talking about people that were dishonest. After which it was their custom to separate, then reassemble to partake of food. So they were talking about getting together and eating together. This one here, Emperor Trajan, the method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those denounced you as Christian is extremely proper. What he's saying is, it's okay to torture them. It is not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as the fixed standard in all cases of this nature. No search should be made for these people when as long as they denounce their God, which is Christ, and don't have a problem adoring our gods, then you can pardon them. All right, but otherwise, yeah, you can kill them. Lucian said, the Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account, and that they worship the crucified sage. He also makes an interesting notation. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time. Which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece. and have common property because they basically don't see it as worth anything in this lifetime. So, you know, these people have studied Christians to know what they believe for the most part and how they should be treated. They didn't just treat everybody the same, obviously. By the way, my son wrote part of this presentation, so I just left some of the stuff in there that he did. So Other Dudes is from Duran. The Jewish Talmud refers to Yeshua being crucified. Mera Bar Serapion wrote about the Jews' wise king being executed by them. And some of the others added a few other things in there that I'll just skip on by. So here's some historical facts that we would know apart from the Bible. A wise man, teacher named Jesus Christus, who performed amazing feats, was crucified by Pontius Pilate, who lived during that time, who reigned during that time, 26 to 36 AD. During the reign of Tiberius, that was the Roman emperor at the time, who reigned from 14 to 37 AD. So we got a time frame of when it all happened. Crucifixion was accompanied by an unusual darkness. A mischievous superstition from Judea was the belief of the Christians. Many Jews and Gentiles were converted to Christianity. Christians met on a fixed day to pray, worship, and eat. They worshipped the man Jesus as God. They were asked to denounce their God. Were generally moral, upstanding citizens, were willing to die for their beliefs, and were being persecuted as early as 64 AD by Nero, because Nero blamed the burning of Rome on the Christians. And hence the reason why he tortured and burned many of them himself, to not have been blamed for it himself, which he was the one technically responsible for the fire. All that makes the person, I mean, if you were just a historian and you were looking at these facts here, you would want to know what on earth started that. Who was this Jesus guy? How did he manage to do all of this? You think about it, what caused all the commotion? What caused devoted, monotheistic Jews to begin worshiping a historical man? Jews don't just do that. What caused them to stop following the law? Sacrifices. What caused them to change their day of worship from Saturday to Sunday? Again, Jews don't do that. Yeah, John.
Wasn't that done because of the Emperor Constantine? He's the one who declared that it was going to be on Sunday, declared to switch from Saturday to Sunday.
The Christians were already meeting on Sunday, according to the Bible, and Constantine was long after. Constantine didn't occur until the early 300s AD. So we're talking about stuff that happened long before Constantine at this point.
Okay, so wait, which book would that be?
Where they were
Meeting on
worshiping,
Sunday.
where they were meeting on the first day of the week. It's in Acts. I forget the exact reference.
All right, thank you.
You know that one off the top of your head?
Next.
What caused them to be willing to die horrible deaths for what they believed? Okay. What caused these people to suddenly just change their mind about everything that was near and dear to them? If we only had some eyewitnesses to tell us, but we do. And the writings are found in the New Testament. So let's take a look at some of the more specific sources that give us an idea where they answer for themselves why they did these things. Okay, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received." By this is not something Paul came up with. This is something he received from somebody else. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. The reason that I have highlighted Cephas is because Paul is unlikely to have used the Aramaic word for Peter's name. And what Paul is repeating here is what's known as the early, or could be the first Christian creed, there's a cadence to what is being said here. It's sort of like when you read it in Greek, it's like reading da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. So it's like, it's something that was to be memorized. Okay, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he rose again according to the Scriptures. You see the cadence to make it easy to remember. They have identified this as a creed of the early church. What that tells you is that the early Christians preached the resurrection. And there's the references where they all do that. In fact, every author of a book in the New Testament, I think with the exception of Jude, mentions the resurrection. Hence the reason why I didn't put Jude down there. I tried to put a reference from each of the authors of the New Testament. So they're all telling us that it was the resurrection, the fact that they saw Jesus alive, is the reason that made them do all of the things that we know from history that they did.
Well, except Paul.
Do what?
Except Paul.
Well, Paul saw the risen Christ.
Oh, well, okay. He saw the risen Christ, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about Jesus after the resurrection, yes. Paul didn't see Jesus before that. Paul was in Antioch, and to my knowledge, I don't think Jesus ever made it to Antioch. Jesus spent most of his life right there around Jerusalem for the most part. Problem with historians is they have a little bit of circular reasoning on this. They say we need, miracles need extraordinary evidence in order to be able to believe them. But the New Testament records extraordinarily reliable eyewitness testimony to miracles. But then the New Testament is discredited because it can't be trusted because it reports miracles. So, just the fact that something reports miracles should not discredit it as a source of historical or reliable information. If God exists, miracles are certainly possible. Now, I may agree that if I am to believe the miracle occurred, that some type of extraordinary evidence might actually be needed, because I don't want to just trust anybody that claims to do a miracle. On the other hand, I don't want to discredit miracles in general and say, well, they can't happen. So let's get out of the circular reasoning and just say, is the evidence credible that a miracle actually occurred here? So, in our more specific sources, of course, we have the 4 Gospels. These are just some papyrus manuscripts and the dates associated with them. The John Ryland's manuscript is usually considered to be the oldest. That's the one down here in the bottom corner. The oldest actual surviving piece of the New Testament. John 18:31 and 33. Interestingly enough, is the place where Jesus said, "What is truth?" Actually, excuse me, that's where Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" It's the oldest piece of the New Testament surviving. Of course, we have good reasons to believe that we haven't lost anything in the New Testament, but I'll come to that in just a second. So, but these are fragments surviving from the 2nd century. Question: can the New Testament writers be trusted? Has the New Testament been corrupted? Has it been changed over time? Is what we have in the New Testament what they originally wrote, or did somebody sneak in something or take out something? Has the New Testament, or was it written close to the events? So, for example, why do I mistrust the Book of Mormon? The Book of Mormon was written about 1820-something or 1830-something. I think it was 1830. By Joseph Smith, who claimed to have had a vision of events that were recorded on golden plates, where he was told to get the golden plates, which we don't have to examine, because they were taken back to heaven. And he supposedly translated the plates, which were written, if you want to close that, go ahead. He supposedly translated the plates that were supposedly written between 600 BC and about 100 AD. So, he's telling us what happened 1,200 years, well, 1800 to 2,400 years before his time, on something that we don't have any way of verifying that what he wrote is correct or not. Okay? Muhammad's the same way. Muhammad is supposedly giving us revelations of what happened in the New and the Old Testament way after it happened. So, when was the New Testament written? Was it written close to the events? Yes, sir.
Isn't it ever recorded that Muhammad performed any miracles?
No.
Well, that's reason to believe it. Huh?
Wait, I thought, from my understanding of Islam, Muhammad cannot perform miracles. Is it
I'm
only
not sure.
that it's only Allah that can perform miracles? Christianity, with Christianity, men are allowed to perform miracles through God, but with Islam, I'm not sure if that's possible.
I'm not entirely possible. To my knowledge, the book of Quran does not record any miracles that he did. And I don't think that he went around claiming to have done any.
Could be wrong.
Yeah. And then, of course, the last question was written by eyewitnesses. So let's take a look at these three questions. Has it been corrupted? We currently have, and this number is rising because the more Greek manuscripts they find, the greater this number gets. Currently, as of the time of this presentation made, there were 5,838 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Most of these are partial, they're not entirely whole. We have over 24,000 if you include some Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic manuscripts, but it was originally written in Greek. So in Greek we have roughly 5,838. And again, rising. A guy by the name of Daniel Wallace has made it his goal and mission in life to go out and actually photograph every one of these and every page associated with them in very high quality photograph pages so that they're not just sitting in a museum somewhere, that anybody can actually inspect them. And I commend him for that. He's quite the New Testament scholar. And he's responsible for finding a bunch of new ones in the process of going out and photographing as many of the ones that we did know about. And every time we find them, we find out that they all agree with one another. For the most part, there are copying errors between them, but the nice thing about copying errors is, I'll give you an example. If I gave you a page out of the Bible in here, and I told every one of you in this room, go home and copy that, just handwrite a copy of that page of the Bible, okay, and then we all brought them back, is there a possibility that at least a few of us in the room would have made a mistake in copying it?
Yes.
By hand? Yes. What are the chances that everybody in the room would have made the same mistake?
Low.
Very low. So a mistake you might have made copying it would be different than one I made. And if everybody else has agreed in the room with what mine said and not what yours said, then even if we had destroyed the original, okay, we would know what was originally written. So when you have enough manuscript copies of something, and by the way, there are more manuscript copies of the New Testament than any other ancient book of history. The closest one is the Odyssey from Homer, and it only has currently about 17 or 1800, I believe. So we're talking about 4,000 more manuscripts than even that very revered book at the time. There is more evidence to support the fact that the New Testament has not been changed than there is of any other ancient document. What we have in the New Testament is what was originally written. The manuscripts give us confidence the New Testament is about 99.5 to 7% uncorrupted. I have a problem with that number. How many of you have ever been looking at the end of the book of Mark and read the footnote on verses 9 through 20, and it says, these verses are not in our oldest manuscripts? You ever seen that? Or there's a verse in 1 John 5:17, I believe, where it refers to to three testifying in heaven, and it essentially says the Father, Son, and Spirit. Again, it's a reference to that verse is usually footnoted and says this verse does not appear. Same thing is also true of John 8, 1 through, I think is verse 11, which is the story of the adulterous woman, where Jesus said, he was without sin, cast the first stone. Those are the three biggest passages in the Bible that may or may not have been in the original New Testament. But here's the thing. They don't make it less likely that what we have, there's additions to it. So I don't like to think of it as 99.5% pure. I like to think of it as 100.5% pure. You see the difference? What we have is not corruptions of the old. What we have is potentially additions, things that were added to it over time. And here's the thing, we've been able to identify. So they're questionable. So I don't base a lot of my doctrinal teaching on the last 11 verses in Mark 16, for example, which is one of the passages that talks about handling snakes.
Drinking deadly poison.
Do it.
And drinking deadly poison.
And drinking deadly poison, that's correct. Of course, I don't find anything there that would contradict Christian doctrine either, because it does say that they will pick up snakes and they will drink deadly poison and it won't hurt them. We have examples in Acts of Paul picking up a deadly snake and it not hurting him. I don't think the passages are saying you should deliberately go out and pick up deadly snakes to test the idea of it. Okay. So don't worry, there are not any rattlesnakes in my bag over here. I'm not going to pull them out for you. So, it can be said, and there could be a whole lot, we could do a whole presentation on this really all by itself. Any idea that the New Testament has been corrupted, just put that out of your head. What we have is what was originally written. So has it been corrupted? No, it has not. We have what was originally written. Was the New Testament written close to the events? Okay, well here's when the events are supposed to have happened. There are two dates for the possible crucifixion and resurrection. They're based on whether Jesus died on Wednesday or Friday. Have you ever heard those arguments?
Yeah, about John. It was John and Matthew, right?
Yeah. I tend to lean towards the died on Friday, crucified on Friday, which would have been April 3rd, 33 AD. That's why I've underlined those. Consequently, the resurrection would have been on April 5th, 33 AD. Paul's conversion is generally believed to have been 2 to 3 years after the events. Paul meets Peter, according to his own words, 3 years later. The writing of Galatians and Corinthians is fairly well established, even among secular scholars, as those dates. They all agree that Paul wrote his letters then. It's not a Christian versus non-Christian atheist, but it doesn't matter. Everybody agrees that's when they were written. Paul is imprisoned in Rome, according to the book of Acts, around 60 to 63 AD. Peter, James, and Paul were all executed between 64 and 67 AD. And then, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which is a major event of history. The temple was destroyed. The Romans were at war against the Jews who were rebelling against them, and they said, we're tired of dealing with you guys. We're going to go in here and just wipe you out. And so they did. They destroyed Jerusalem and tore the temple down, and then basically ran the Jews out of Jerusalem and told them not to come back. And the last of the stand was made at Masada, up on top of that mountain, where basically they committed suicide, I believe, rather than die at the hands of the Romans in roughly 74 AD. And when did the Jews return?
1947.
1947. Was that prophesied that they would do that?
Yes.
In fact, it was. But we'll handle that in the prophecy section one of these days. Interesting though, the Bible doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem. You would think that it might do that, right? You would think that it might. But the book of Acts stops before this. The book of Acts stops before this event. I mean, Luke is recording a series of events that's going on here, and he stops with Paul being imprisoned in Rome. If Paul had been, if he had been killed at that point, you'd think that Luke would have recorded that Paul had been killed, or Peter, and so forth. He recorded the deaths of others in the book when they died, when James, John's brother, was killed, and some others. But he doesn't record the death of Peter, James, and Paul, who were primary figures in Christianity. What that lets you know, by the way, is in all likelihood Luke was written before their deaths. Okay, but we'll come back to that one in a second. So here's the events. The Synoptic Gospels and Markan priority. That is the idea that, Markan priority is the idea that Mark was the one that was written first, as opposed to Matthew priority, which is, or Matthean priority. It's an interesting little chart here. Okay, 70%, 76% of Mark is in Luke and Matthew. All three of the Gospels share them combined. But then you can see on the outer part there how much is shared by Matthew and Mark, and then over here how much is shared between Luke and Mark. And then in some cases there's Luke and Mark share information that's not in, Luke and Matthew share information that's not in Mark. Has anybody ever heard referred to the document of Q? Document of Q?
No.
That would be this. Okay. They believe that there was another document out there that Luke and Matthew shared their information, even though nobody's ever found it necessarily. The reason we believe Mark was written first, 97% of Mark is contained in Matthew and Luke. You combine it, only 3% of Mark is actually unique to itself. Matthew and Luke appear to have abridged some of Mark's stories, so in some cases Mark gives a little bit more detail than they do, and they take out a few things. Why would Mark leave out much of Jesus' teachings if he was copying Matthew? For example, much of the Sermon on the Mount that's in Matthew is not in Mark. It would be, if Mark was copying Matthew, you'd think if you're going to put something in there, you'd put the Sermon on the Mount in there. Mark tends to have a rougher, less polished Greek style. Matthew and Luke tend to alter potential theological difficulties. For example, Mark says, it's the one place in the Bible where it says Jesus was angry. When he was looking at the Pharisees over the man with the withered hand, it says Jesus in anger, said, which one's easier, for me to heal this man's hand or, So Matthew and Luke have a tendency to polish some of those things that Mark didn't. And Mark contains more Aramaic words, which Matthew and Luke translate into Greek. And Aramaic is what they spoke. Anybody know where Mark got his information from? He wasn't one of the 12. He got it from Peter. Mark is Peter's gospel. Okay? Mark is basically recording what Peter was going around preaching. And Mark is also in a series of, it's kind of like if you read through it, it doesn't read as nice and flowy as some of the other stuff. I don't know if you've ever noticed that about it. It has a tendency to be non-chronological also. And that's because Peter is remembering and he's putting it in some little snippets that are easy to remember, and Mark is recording what Peter was preaching. Clement of Alexandria claimed Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was ministering in Rome. Eusebius says Peter came to Rome when Claudius was emperor, so that was between 41 and 54 AD. Peter appears to have been in Jerusalem in Acts 15, which would have been around 49 AD. Peter appears to have been in Corinth before Paul, because Paul refers to Peter having been there before Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, which would have been around 55 AD. Paul appears to quote Luke, which means Luke was written by then, by 55 AD. That puts the writing of Mark's gospel somewhere between 50 and 53 AD. 17 to 20 years after the events. Could you write a book about stuff that happened to you 17, 20 years ago? And be pretty accurate about it? Yeah, you might.
If some books were written before another book, why'd they kind of arrange the order?
Why did they rearrange the order?
Like Apostle Paul, here he wrote 13 books of the New Testament, but some of them he wrote before the others, yet it comes later in the Bible.
I don't know the answer to that question, why they're arranged in the order. They have a tendency to be arranged in length order. Romans is the longest of them. 1 Corinthians is next, and 1 Corinthians might actually be a little bit longer than Romans, but yes, technically Thessalonians is usually attributed to Paul as being his first book, and Timothy as being his last, 2 Timothy. Why they didn't put them in chronological order, I don't really know. But we do fairly know the chronological order. But the Gospels are in the same have the same issue. I think Matthew was included first for Jewish reasons. Because what does Matthew start with? Anybody know it? Matthew 1:1?
The genealogy.
Yes, genealogy. Yeah, if you're going to start reading the New Testament, the first thing you're going to get a whole face full of is a whole chapter of genealogies. I guess that's going to test your ability to stick at it.
Like Chronicles.
But if you're a Jew, you're going to go, and I've seen some testimonies like this. One of them was in Lee Strobel's book, which I thought was a powerful testimony of a Jew who who's told all his life not to read the New Testament. And then he opened up Matthew and he read it and he said, "This is a Jewish book." Starts with the genealogy. Shocked him.
How about the significance of just AD and BC? The fact that all the time reference. I mean, that's pretty significant that you say AD and you say BC, and a lot of the books and a lot of the historical and a lot of the teachings, it's all based on Christ.
Well, that's because, obviously Christianity has affected our world greatly. And the people that put those calendars together were Christians. The Jewish calendar doesn't do that, by the way. The Jewish calendar is running, we're in like year 5,000 something right now, according to the Jewish calendar. I forget what it is. Yes, it obviously was meant and based on Jesus' birth. And here we're talking about the resurrection. There's a whole lot more historical detail that could be given about Jesus' life, particularly about when he was born, because that's not one of the things that we're given a lot of detail about. What we do know here, though, is that in all likelihood, Mark is written no later than 20 years after the event. I know that'd be hard for you to do, Eli, because you're not that old, but...
It's his birthday, though. It's right there.
Hey, that's right. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
And you are 17, 18 today? 18 today. Very good.
You know,
Not to be 18.
I think it's agreed upon that Jesus was a person, but like I think some people just doubt that he was the Christ is the main argument.
Well, depends on
It's
you say
my
who.
conclusion. That's fine.
Depends you talk about who's agreed upon. We can talk about scholars, yes, but the general public, not so.
Incidentally, some of the newest manuscripts of the New Testament are being found in ancient mummy masks. What they did with a lot of the papyrus that they couldn't use anymore, it had been written or it was too faded or whatever, they just used that old paper to make mummy masks, at least in Egypt they did. And it included a whole host of ancient writings, not just New Testament writings, but some other things. So they've got some now which apparently date to around 90 AD, which are fragments of the Gospel of Mark and Luke, I believe. So the John Rylands manuscript may not be the oldest one now. We may actually have some fragments of the New Testament dating from the first century itself. So we know they were written in the first century. Was the New Testament written close to the events? Okay, here you have conservative dates versus liberal dates. So we just looked at Mark was written around 50 to 53 AD, Matthew a little bit after that, Luke around the same time, John generally believed to be before 70 AD because John refers to, for example, the temple as if it was still standing or the walls of Jerusalem as if they were still standing. If he had written after 70 AD, knowing that they'd been destroyed, he might have referred to them in past tense instead of as they were. Acts had to have been written somewhere in that range before the deaths of Peter, James, and John, or Peter, James, and Paul. Romans, we know around 55 to 58. Corinthians, you see it, Thessalonians being the oldest. Notice in the liberal dates, Paul's letters are the same. Nobody disagrees with Paul's letters. Peter's epistles, on the other hand, some of them believe that they're later, and Revelation about the same time. Why do the liberals want to put the dates of the Gospels in after 70 AD? Anybody have any idea?
Because isn't that, how long did John live to be? John died on the Isle of Patmos in the late 90s AD. I guess that,
and he would have been in his teens probably when he was with Jesus, so he could have been 80 something, maybe.
maybe that's a discredit that John was the one who actually wrote these things.
Well, the reason why John is considered much later in the 90 to 110 AD range had to do with, they believed, scholars for a long time believed that the Christology associated with the book of John, in other words, his strong emphasis on the fact that Jesus was God, was a later addition to Christianity. But everything we've shown, even from the history of those who weren't Christians, showed that Jesus was worshipped as God, and the John Rylands manuscript is around that time. So the liberal dates on John have moved earlier. But why on Matthew, Mark, and Luke are they generally believed to have been after 70 AD? Any idea there?
Something to do with the temple destruction, right?
Correct. Jesus predicted that, one of these days you're going to look at the temple and every one of these stones, not one of them is going to be on top of one another. So Jesus predicted that the temple would be destroyed. And if you have a bias against miracles, then you would have to say that those passages were written after the fact. And since that happened in 70 AD, many of the liberals want to put the dating of the Gospels after 70 AD. However, yeah.
Was it Joshua, I think, or whoever that walked around the city like 7 days and then eventually the walls just came down?
Mm-hmm.
Have they found that city in like...
Yes, they have found Jericho, and yes, they found the walls fell outward, and yes, they have found houses that were built into the wall, which was in a section that didn't fall down, which was probably where Rahab lived. And yes, the dates match when the Bible says they do, and yes, it was burned, as the book of Joshua refers to it.
So then
How
there...
about that?
Yeah. So it's just really confusing to why somebody wouldn't believe that in miracles and all that. But I can understand in the society.
They found footprints. No, I'm just kidding. They didn't really. Yeah. That would have been cool if they did, but no. To me, there's enough there to say that the walls did fall out, and the walls, as they were built, were pretty formidable. Joshua and crowd would not have been able to have overcome the walls otherwise. Yeah, it's a different presentation though, Eli.
Sorry.
J. Warner Wallace gives this neat little chart here, which I find to be interesting. The temple is destroyed in AD 70, siege of Jerusalem, deaths of James, Peter, and Paul. Again, Luke writes Acts because he doesn't mention any of those events. The best illustration I've ever had of that, let's say you were reading a biography of John F. Kennedy. You're reading a biography of John F. Kennedy, and the book ends with him becoming president of the United States. What can you probably conclude about that book, even without looking at the date that it was written?
It was written before his
It
assassination.
was written before his assassination. Because who writes a biography of John F. Kennedy without mentioning the assassination? Right? Hence the reason why the book of Acts, in all likelihood, had to have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem or the deaths of Peter, Paul, and John, because had those events happened, Luke certainly would have recorded them. And since Paul quotes Luke in 1 Corinthians, then in all likelihood Luke was written before 53 to 57 AD. Hence Luke writes his gospel, according to J. Warner Wallace, from 50 to 53 AD. And since Mark was written before Luke, Mark has to have been written somewhere between 45 and 50 AD. Again, I looked at some other scholars on the dates and came up with the other dates that I did, but still you still end up with Mark having been written about 50 AD. And Luke written not long after that, and Acts being written not long after that. So, the events, even if I wanted to accept the liberal dates, that they were written, let's say 70 to 80 AD, that's still not even 50 years after the events. That's 40 years after the events or so. And for people that are 70 and 80 years old, I would think you could probably write something. John, I know you're not that old, but you could probably write something about when you were 20 years old, right?
Right.
Events that happened around that time. And recall good quality about, where you were and what things were like. The earliest Christian creed is usually dated within 5 years of the events. Acts 18:12. I love it when verses like this appear in the Bible. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. To an apologist, this is like an excitement. To a historian and archaeologist, these are exciting verses. To the average Bible reader, it's like, why do I need to know about Gallio was proconsul of Achaia? Well, it's very nice when you find an inscription that lists his name in a list of other names that held the same positions that are associated with the rulers of the Roman Empire at the time, so that you can date this to 51 to 52 AD. In other words, these people served one-year terms, and so you know when this is referring to. So I just pulled one little thing out of Wikipedia. Gallio's tenure can be fairly accurately dated between 51 and 52 AD because of the inscription. Therefore, the events of Acts 18 can be dated to this period. This is significant. I find this line by Wikipedia to be very interesting. It is the most accurately known date in the life of Paul. Since we can pinpoint this date, this is why we know when Paul's letters were written, because we can base the events in Acts in addition to those numbers there to come up with when he was in Galatia, when he was in Corinthian, where he was when he wrote those letters, and they come up with the dates. And that's why when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, I delivered to you that which I also received, and he says in Galatians 2:1, after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas. Okay, and then 3 years after his conversion, according to Galatians 1:18, he meets Peter for the first time. In all likelihood, it was during that first meeting with Peter that he received the little creed here that was being repeated about the resurrection, which is just after the events. So, was the New Testament written close to the events? Everybody agrees the New Testament was written in the first century. So
What about that 110?
Norman Geisler once said, the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, which is the way they wrote in the first century. So what does that tell you about when the New Testament was written?
First century.
It was all written in the first century. That's like missing the forest because of the trees, right? The writing dates range from 0. In other words, the book of Acts was probably recording events as they were going on, actually, to 65 years at most after the events. Accounts were written while eyewitnesses were still alive, so you could check out some of the stuff that was written if it was wrong. And people who were there could have corrected somebody else who might have written it down wrong. Disciples were preaching the resurrection immediately. And that's the reason why they did what they did. These dates simply do not allow enough time for legend. Do we have any Christian legends?
Book of Mormon?
No, that's a cult as far as I'm concerned, not really a legend. Do we have any Christian legendary material? Yeah. When was it written? You know, Drew?
Well, I'm just thinking like St. Nick tried to almost make some sort of legendary material.
Right.
I don't know when that
Like
is.
St. Patrick.
St. Patrick, I'm sorry, you're right.
Has anybody ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas?
Oh, yeah. Gospel of Mary.
Anybody ever heard of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene?
Yeah, I heard of that. Heard of it.
Anybody ever heard of it? There's a number of what are referred to as apocryphal Gospels.
The Lost Gospels.
Yeah. There's a number of Christian writings that speculated about Jesus' childhood. Jesus resurrecting a whole group of sparrows that died, for example. Some of these things. When were all of them written? In the 2nd century. 100 years after the events. That's how long it takes legends to start. So we got plenty of Christian legendary material. It's there if you want to read it. But guess what? The Christians recognized it as legendary material, and it's not in the New Testament. Okay? It's there. And when you read it, you go, well, that looks kind of legendary. Okay? Because it is. Fabricated legends also would have used more prominent names. In all likelihood, they would have put these characters in a better light. In other words, who would have named the Gospel of Mark? Who was he? Who was Luke? Luke's not even, he's a Greek. He's not even a Jew. Who are these people? You want to name it Matthew? Yeah. Okay, we got one like that. You want to name it Peter? Yeah. We do have a book named James, which was written by John's brother or Jesus' brother?
Jesus' brother.
Jesus' brother. Yeah.
So, just wondering, how many Gentiles have written the Bible? How many Gentile authors are there?
Just Luke, I believe. Just Luke. Depending on who wrote Hebrews. That one's still up in the air. Some people think it was Paul. Some people think it was Barnabas. Doesn't look like a Pauline letter to me whenever I read it. It reads different. So was the New Testament written close to the events? Was it written by eyewitnesses? Well, certainly PLINY would have been written by eyewitnesses. Okay? For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We saw it. They knew the difference between myth and history. It was not cleverly devised tales. They knew the difference between what was true and what wasn't. Geisler and Turek, the authors of the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Great title. List 84 facts in Acts and 59 in John that are confirmed by archaeology and history. Names, locations, and so forth. The New Testament writers got the customs, the dates, the order of events, the cities, the leaders, the languages, the weather, the travel patterns, the roads, the topography, and the sailing details all right. It's likely they got the resurrection right also. Okay? If they can be corroborated on all of those other things, do we have any reason not to believe that they were witnesses of the resurrection itself? Paul in the Gospels, nothing that Paul wrote contradicted the Gospels. Since we have good reason to trust Paul, we can at least trust the Gospels and Acts' basic historical facts, including the conversion of James and Jesus' brother, Jesus' brother James. Is Paul crazy? The disciples were liars. Paul's craziness made things worse. There's some people that actually attribute the rise of Christianity more to Paul than Jesus. They really are. How can we know that the accounts in the Gospels came from the disciples and are there? And are there other reasons to trust them? First of all, we don't have anybody else that has claimed that you can point to as a source that says so-and-so wrote the Gospel of Matthew, for example. It's attributed to Matthew. It was always historically attributed to Matthew. The church fathers understood that it came from Matthew. It was never attributed to anybody else. Why do you think, if you're going to say it wasn't written by Matthew, then give me a reason why, other than it, I don't want to believe it's account of the resurrection. Give me something better than that. The Gospels actually contain a lot of very humiliating details. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. If it was a made-up story, who would put these kinds of facts in there? That Jesus' family didn't believe him? That he couldn't perform miracles in his own home, for example? Wouldn't perform them there. That people rejected him? If you were really making up a story, you'd want everybody to accept him, not just, That he was accused of being possessed by a demon. That he said some things that are hard to understand and seemed to contradict himself. In other words, do we all agree that there's some passages in the New Testament that are kind of hard to understand? Wouldn't it be nicer, cleaner if those weren't there? Yeah, so why are they there? It's because it's what he said. He had a bad reputation for the company he kept. The disciples consistently asked stupid questions, like, "Can I be first in your kingdom?" I'm sure Jesus just had to go. Come on.
Yeah, I think young guy. It was more than that.
Disciples behaved rashly, rudely, and even sometimes violently. And why would Jesus pick somebody that was going to betray him? And most of the disciples ran away. That's the story I want to tell about myself. I ran away. And women were the first to discover the empty tomb. Yeah, women's testimony wasn't taken into account.
It's the first.
Yeah. You don't find the New Testament writers, you don't find them going out of their way, the New Testament writers themselves, other than the Gospels. The Gospels recorded it as it happened, but you don't find them quoting the women. Look at Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 of who saw the resurrected Jesus. Whose names are missing? There are no women in that list. Now, why would the first creed of Christians not list the women first in that creed? Could it be for other cultural reasons at the time? But yet we know that the women were the first ones to see him. J. Warner Wallace has a line in a movie called God's Not Dead 2, which, by the way, is a stupid movie, but aside from that, he does play an interesting part. Mr. Kane, I'm afraid you misunderstand. When I started my study, I was a devout atheist. I approached the Gospels as a committed skeptic, not a believer. I'm not a Christian today because I was raised that way or because it satisfies some need or accomplishes some goal. I'm simply a Christian because it's evidentially true. He likes to point to the discrepancies in the account because he says between eyewitness testimony there's always little nuances that seem to contradict each other, but when you actually put them together they form a whole. So you have a few things like Judas returns the bribe money in Matthew, but Acts reports that the Jews used the money to buy a field. They don't really contradict one another. Okay. How many angels were at the tomb? Some of them report that there were two. Some of them report that there was one. Well, where there's two, there's at least one. Just because somebody didn't report that there were two, and said, it'd be different if one of them said, "I'm telling you, there was one, and there was only one there." And then somebody said, "No, I'm telling you, there were two there." Okay, well now we got a contradiction, but that's not what it is. It's like one reports one angel, one reports two. So the other one didn't say anything about the other one. No big deal. Of course, the apostles did die for their belief. Martyr deaths. Does this prove that what they believed was true?
No.
Not necessarily. There are people that are willing to die for what they believe. There are people that are willing to go and blow themselves up for what they believe. But are those people in a position to have known what they actually believed was really true or not?
No.
Does a Muslim who blows himself up, committing suicide, is he in a position to really know whether his religion is true? No. These people were in a position to know whether Christianity was true. They knew it. They knew whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. Now, some of them, just for honor reasons, it's my understanding that some people are willing to die for a lie that they know is a lie, just to maintain their honor. It's hard for me to imagine somebody doing that, but I'm told that that is possible. Is it possible that all of these people would have done that, though?
Unlikely.
Somebody would have recanted. Somebody would have gone and said, yeah. So was it written by eyewitnesses? Yes. Close to the events? Yes. Has it been changed? No. If it's not reliable, then what alternatives are there? I'll just rush through these. Apostles didn't write it. It's legendary material. We've already seen that can't be true. It's too early for that. The apostles were all crazy. They were all liars. They were hallucinating, or maybe even they were deceived. So were they all crazy?
No.
I mean, who follows crazy people? Really? Have you ever been around somebody who has lost touch with reality? It's kind of scary, isn't it? Right? You know that they've lost touch with reality. They are out there. You don't follow those people. You try to get help for those people. The disciples weren't crazy. We have their writings. They're not the ravings of a lunatic. Lunatics ramble and contradict themselves. It's not legend. I mean, Thomas basically is a case here. He's like, I'm not going to believe this unless I touch him. He had that opportunity. Were they liars? That is the first story that the Jews made up, that the disciples came and stole the body. The problems with that, first of all, there's one really interesting problem with that. What does it say about the tomb itself?
They had a giant boulder in front of it.
Green cards.
No, that's not what I'm looking for. It did have.
Stamps on it, they did stamp it.
If the Jews were running around telling everybody that the disciples stole the body, then what does that say about the tomb?
It was empty.
It was empty. That's correct. Because if Jesus' body had been there, then the Jews would have been parading Jesus' dead body around the town instead of claiming that the disciples stole it. So, interestingly enough, the Jews' own explanation is a tacit claim that the tomb is empty. Admission that the body's not there. It doesn't explain how they transform their lives, though. I mean, if they're living a lie, I mean, what motivation do they have for doing that? It doesn't explain why they risk their lives. It also doesn't explain the bigger the lie or conspiracy, the harder it is for multiple people to sustain it. So I don't believe generally in conspiracy theories because people just, they cough it up. That's why we found out about Richard Nixon and Watergate. People coughed it up. I mean, you just can't maintain a gigantic conspiracy like NASA really didn't go to the moon. Are you kidding me?
Or, well, you do have the one conspiracy about the people wanted to bomb the American airport in Cuba. I forgot what that was. It was supposed to be a false flag. That one was proven to be CIA document was recently unclassified, but yeah. So I will say this.
But again, the evidence comes out of the conspiracy.
It was decades later, though.
It might have been. But
Sorry.
what you'll find, in J. Warner Wallace's book, he goes into this in great detail because he's used to dealing with criminals that want to come up with conspiracies between themselves about how to explain something. And he says the more people you get involved in a conspiracy, the greater the chance of it being exposed. When you have one person involved, it's easy to cover it up. When there's two, it's, it can still be hard, but when you get 3, 4, 5, it becomes impossible. They can always entrap the people. Plus, if they were all liars, would they really have been believed? Maybe they were delusional. Actually, it's a very popular position these days to believe that there's a skeptic out there by the name of Richard Carrier, who's written a number of books on the idea that the disciples hallucinated. But that doesn't explain the empty tomb. You could hallucinate maybe the resurrection of Jesus, but his body would still be there, wouldn't it? And then you could have gone over and checked it out. And grief doesn't cause people to imagine new experiences with the deceased. Psychological studies show it only shows that they might have hallucinations of the way they were remembered, but nothing new. And group hallucination is just not supported at all. People just simply do not have the same hallucination. 12 people cannot have the exact same hallucination that they saw Jesus and that the man sat and ate with them. And then, of course, Thomas knew that he wanted to make sure it wasn't a hallucination. In fact, you'll find them saying, in some cases, he's a ghost, and they go, no, it's not a ghost. They do. This movie, on the other hand, actually is pretty good, and it doesn't go down the road of the apostles being fooled. But my son stuck the picture in here for me, and so I left it. There are some that would claim that an imposter convinced the disciples that he was Jesus after the fact. Talk about trying to come up with some idea that just that stretches the limits of credibility.
You have to be a really good master in disguise. Like if these people, if you hang out with someone for a year straight, not only, you know that person.
Yeah. Some even claim that Jesus had a twin brother. You were going to ask something, Elon?
Two things. Didn't 500 people have like the same dream after the crucifixion?
Well, it wasn't a dream. 500 people saw him alive. Yeah.
Oh,
And Paul said a lot of those people are still alive today. So go ask them if you have a question about this. If you have a question about who saw him alive, then I'm going to give you the list. And there was another event where 500 people saw him, yeah.
and,
Durant's sense of humor, my son's sense of humor. The last selfie is what that says below it. Maybe their claims were exaggerated. In other words, the disciples did see something, but the account was later embellished with legendary material. Again, the resurrection is what we're talking about here, and it was way too early in the events. The disciples reported the resurrection from the very start. That's not something that was added later. And the students of the disciples reported the same thing the disciples reported. In other words, the church fathers reported the same thing. And there's, of course, not enough time for a legend to spread. I won't go through the details here, but if you were trying to write a legend, it seems to me like you would want to write it a little bit more exciting than the way Paul writes it in Galatians 1. It's kind of like, yeah, it's persecuting Christians. It doesn't really, especially when you get down to the end. I went to see James, I went to see Peter. 14 years later, I went out on a missionary journey. It sounds more like history than legend. So, here we have the facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried. His death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. On the other hand, the disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. They were transformed from doubters to very bold proclaimers of the gospel. The resurrection was their central message. They preached the message of Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem. The church was born and grew. Orthodox Jews who believed in Christ made Sunday their primary day of worship. James, who was a skeptic, was converted. And Paul, who was a skeptic, was converted. Those are all true facts of history. The best explanation for how all of that happened, of course, when you look at the empty tomb also being, this would be probably the most, this would be the fact of history that would be most contested. Was the tomb really empty? There are some that would try to explain all of this by saying the tomb wasn't empty. They didn't know where they buried him. Of course, we have the story about whose tomb he was buried in, Joseph of Arimathea, and Nicodemus helped Joseph of Arimathea bury him. Joseph of Arimathea certainly would have known where his tomb was, and the whole story revolves around the women going to the tomb that they knew where it was. So they knew he had died. They knew where the tomb was. In fact, in all likelihood, we know where the tomb is today. There are two locations for the tomb, but one of them is better corroborated than the other one. One of them appears to be Constantine's wife, who wanted to identify a particular location. She had this idea that she wanted to go around identifying the locations of the certain events. She had a tendency to go with legendary material. When we look at it now, they just recently redone that particular tomb because the Catholic Church built a shrine over it. They cut the top off of it. So it's not a hole in the wall anymore. It's what used to be like that. Anyhow, I've not been to Jerusalem to actually see it, but from what I have looked at, it appears to have been the actual tomb, and it's still empty, by the way, in case you're wondering. If it had not been empty, opponents would have produced the body, and Christianity never gets started. I mean, just plain and simple. Unless nobody knew where it was. There are some people that suggested Jesus was just thrown into a mass grave with everybody else that was crucified, and then that makes the entire story just completely false. And again, that just doesn't make sense. every one of the church fathers agreed with what the apostles wrote. What we have here, Clement was a disciple of Paul, and is probably mentioned by Paul in one of his letters. Ignatius was a disciple of John. So these were the people that had direct contact with people that had direct contact with Jesus. That's pretty cool at the time. They all were the ones that were reporting what these people were telling them, other than what was already written. So what's the best explanation?